Combat in video games can vary in quantity, quality, and style. While I can think of a handful of games that excel in almost every regard, they are few and far between. But creating a combat system of high caliber is not my focus today. For today, I'm going to be analyzing and recreating the melee combat animations from The Legend of Spyro: The Eternal Night. I won't be talking about the combat itself. I'm only going to focus on the animation. I feel like that there's already a lot that's been said about the combat mechanics in this game, and almost any of my opinions wouldn't really be adding to the conversation or saying anything new. But anyway. Just like I did when I recreated the jumping animations, I am animating Spyro with an empty. I go over it more in another video, but to keep it brief, I'm attaching Spyro to an empty, and then I'm animating the empty in the Blender world space. This allows me to add movement to the Spyro model and rig without actually animating their objects with a capital O in Blender. This is a non-destructive workflow to the rig, and since I have plans to port these animations into a game engine, this is the best practice that I'm aware of at this time. It just feels weird to animate a static model sometimes, so I like to simulate some of the movement you'd expect from the game. I took a peek at the meshes used in the VFX to see if I could recreate them, but I quickly realized that that is out of the scope of this video. The slash meshes are all here, but instead of the meshes all being, like a separate object or a separate collection of objects, most of these slash meshes are combined to this giant tangly mess, and, sorting through these and getting them into a usable state that resembles the actual game would have taken time and focus away from just recreating the animations. I do want to recreate these VFX since, after doing this study, I found that these slashes really carry the attacks and combat as a game mechanic. It feels very empty without them. And if I had to guess, it looks like these are all one object, and the individual meshes that you see here that I'm selecting are all UV'd out next to each other in a stack. And then there's some programming that drives the properties of a shader, and that shader combined with the programming tells the game which VFX to quote-unquote activate. This is all speculation on my end. I will recreate the VFX eventually, but that's for the future. I'm getting sidetracked and I need to steer back on topic. But that is the state of the VFX right now. Okay, let's get started. Ground Combat Attack 1. This animation took me about 30 minutes to recreate. It really is that simple. There's one anticipation pose wherein he crouches for about 2 frames, and then he enters the slash phase where he pushes forward with a little burst. His spine straightens out, his feet curl underneath him, and his legs extend. Meanwhile, his head bends down and shoves forward, and it carries the illusion of momentum. His wings straighten out in response to the sudden shift in momentum. Finally, there's the overshoot. From what I can see, there's 4 major parts to it. And the first is that his head curls forward just a tiny bit more. It doesn't snap up, it stays tucked in. I like this detail because it makes his large head look and feel heavy. Second, his wings pull all the way forward, and I think they did this to match just how suddenly Spyro stops in the middle of this attack. Thirdly, his tail flips forward and curls up into the air before settling into the recovery. The recovery phase is super short. In this instance, I counted maybe 4 frames where he stays down for just a little bit in the final pose of the overshoot phase, and he just kind of sinks into it. And that is all for Attack 1. Let's move on to Attack 2. This animation is really fast. I think there's just over 20 frames, at least that I counted. It might vary depending on the region that this game was released in and what the frame rate was, that kind of thing. The recovery phase from Attack 1 doubles as the anticipation phase for Attack 2. I think that's really smart, really cool. His spine twists a tiny bit and his head follows it. For the slash, he snaps toward the right with both his head and his spine following this motion, Since this is a shorter animation, he doesn't really have an overshoot for it. Maybe like 1 frame of energy absorption, but that's it. His paws come to the ground and he bunches his spine up just a teeny little bit. This pose is pretty smart because regardless if he's about to transition into attack 3 or revert back to an idle pose, the transition will always be incredibly short in game and it won't look awkward or jarring. And now we have attack 3. Okay, got a lot to say about this one. From the recovery pose in attack 2, he pushes to the left just a little bit in anticipation for attack 3. It's quite subtle. From here, he enters the slash phase of the animation, wherein he jumps into the air and does a little 360. His tail carries the weight of this attack, since from here it responds in a very snappity way to the sudden change in velocity. Somehow, the spin, the actual spin, is incredibly short in comparison to the anticipation and recovery phases. I think that they animated it in this way to let the VFX play out, because the VFX itself is on screen for longer than Spyro is actually doing the animation movement, if that makes sense. Okay, that is the basic 3-hit combo for the ground. Kind of flying through these. So now I want to cover the animation wherein he knocks a character or an enemy up into the air. So if the player presses and holds the attack button, Spyro will first perform the first attack and then automatically transition into attack that knocks an enemy into the air. It transitions very cleanly from attack 1, and in spite of its length is a pretty simple animation in theory. Really, this was the hardest of the ground animations to make because there's a lot of arcs and a pretty dramatic amount of overshoot that is very visible if you're paying attention to it. Spyro's head and crest carry the momentum of this attack. Much like with the others, the anticipation pose doubles as a recovery pose from attack 1. The anticipation goes on for maybe 3 frames. Spyro's wings pop up, and his spine adjusts ever so slightly. Then he pushes forward for about 1.5 of his body length. His spine is parallel with the ground, and his paws briefly pop up as he travels forward, so like a little jump. Just before the animation transitions into the slash phase, his paws reconnect with the ground and his spine bunches up, kind of like a cat. The slash phase itself is pretty brief, but it has a lot of overshoot. It's a bit unrealistic, but when the momentum stops, his feet stay locked in place for the animation. His front legs come off the ground, and his head bends downward in a really dramatic way. His wings pull forward to simulate a sudden shift in momentum, much like with the Attack 1 animation. And then his spine snaps upward to create this satisfying arc. His head is a touch delayed in comparison to the spine, and it reaches the end of the intended travel just a few frames after the spine completes its intended travel. Then he holds this pose for about 3 frames, which gives the crest time to bounce back into its intended position. His wings pop back out, perhaps a little further than their rest pose, before falling back into place as the pose enters the recovery phase. The recovery phase is incredibly short with this animation. Right after his crest and wings reach the last, they absorb the last of the imparted velocity, Spyro returns to the ground in a pose that allows for a transition to either back into his idle pose, or he could start the 3-hit combo all over again, or he could transition into a jump and begin performing air combos, or he could do the ground pound attack, or, I think you get it. Okay, ground pound. Since I mentioned it, I think I will cover ground pound next. Yeah. Before I started working on this animation, I really wanted to get the timing of the movement, just right. This isn't really a remark about the animation as much as it is about the movement of the in-game capsule. I couldn't really see what the attack was doing in relation to like the space around Spyro. So I eyeballed the position of the environment in relation to the camera. Once the camera moved in world space, I would keyframe my empty to follow it in suit. Getting the timing was easy, and I only had to massage the curve a little bit to get the same snap as before. If you were curious about it, this is the curve I started with, and this is the curve I felt best reflected the in-game movement. I've got like a little side-by-side here. They may reach the desired position at the same time, but the shape of this curve influences how it feels during the process of reaching it, if that makes any sense. But anyway, on to the animation. It's really simple in comparison to that. Since we're starting from his neutral, like mid-air pose, it's pretty easy to transition into the next keyframe, which is him curling into this little ball. He flips about 3 times while remaining stationary in midair. After the 3rd flip, he begins to move downward and complete a 4th flip, of which begins from the moment he begins descending to the moment he makes contact with the ground. I hope that makes sense. I hope that's clear. Once he's made contact with the ground, he pops back up one more time for a final rotation, and this time this is to help him transition into a more neutral pose. And after this, the in-game animation handler kicks in, and we see him complete the same landing animation from his regular jump sequence. Okay, it feels like a good place to start talking about the air combat, which provided its own unique challenges, but I think I've got them tackled in turn. So, Attack 1 and Attack 2. You may be wondering why these 2 animations are bundled together in this section, but I'll explain. Air Attacks 1 and 2 are actually the same animation, just repeated. I'm not sure why Chrome did this. Maybe they were trying to save space or time during development, but I think it looks and feels really cool during gameplay. This animation is not complex. It's the same starting pose as shared with the ground pound, which is just this neutral, like, air pose. His entire body rotates to the left, and he just spins. Admittedly, most of the movement here is coming from the empty. I didn't animate his bones to all follow an arc, but that's okay because I can get it to export just the same. It's worth noting that his body doesn't remain in the same pose during the animation, as in the animators could have just made this one keyframe, spun him, and called it a day, but they didn't. If you'll notice, his hips and tail actually arc up just a teeny bit during the moment when the hitbox activates. His tail also straightens and stiffens, perhaps to look more like a weapon than an organic body part. And finally, upon completing the attack, he reaches a full 360 in rotation, and the player has an option to, press the attack button again or perform another action. The former will see him holding his pose and re-entering the attack state, and the latter will see the animation handler, kick in and have him enter a descent state, should the player not press any buttons. Okay, wow, Attack 3. By the time I started recreating this animation, I was feeling pretty antsy to finish this section of this project, so buckle up, we're almost done. We begin with the ending pose of Attack 2, before quickly shifting into a modified version of a pose from his falling state. From there, he performs, it's not quite a flip, and it's not quite a cartwheel. To perform this attack, first his torso folds in, while his back legs and tail remain somewhat unchanged. His whole body rotates forward, and at the end of the rotation, all of the diagonal movement has been resolved, and he returns to a more neutral pose. His wings tuck in just a hair, which I think adds to selling the speed and weight of this movement. This one was really hard to recreate because the movement is just so weird here. I really struggled, and at one point I had to take some creative liberties with the transition times, because even if the animation was matching my footage, it just felt weird and it didn't flow right. So I made some slight tweaks, but I haven't had the chance to test whether or not they'll flow right, like after export. Also, as a final note in my footage, if you let this animation continue and keep attacking, he will actually transition into a landing animation, which makes him look like he's standing in midair, which is a little bit silly, but likely a consequence of the developers being crunched for time during production. Okay, that is as many animations as I am willing to complete right now. This is shaping up to be a pretty long video. I did not animate the slow-mo combat because I feel that that is a separate game mechanic or a sub-mechanic within the combat system itself. I think when I recreate these, it will be for a separate video. I don't know. It depends on a couple of different things, but mainly if people want to see it or not. As far as Cinder goes, usually if I animate Spyro in some way, I'll animate Cinder in tandem, but I did not give all of these animations to Cinder. A lot of these animations are tailored specifically to Spyro's shape and silhouette, and they just don't look right when slapped on Cinder. A head bash coming from her just doesn't have the same impact, since her model is a little softer, not as many jagged edges. I am working on combat animations for her, but that will be a separate video because I'm pulling from a couple different sources for those attacks, like, from A New Beginning, maybe from like DS versions, or maybe some Dawn of the Dragon, I don't know. We'll have to see, but it is coming. So I kept most of my opinions to myself in the beginning of the video, but since we're here, I'll just share a little bit. I think the combat in the console version of Eternal Night is serviceable and it gets the job done, but it's very bare bones and it just needed a little bit more quality of life functions. I think a lock-on function and a function that immediately rotates you toward the closest enemy would have really helped this game. At the same time, I extend my sympathy to the developers. I'm sure that they were working under some really tight circumstances, and they gave the base functionality the most attention and polish that they could. But this is getting into review and opinion territory of the game, and I'm just trying to be objective and frank. If you have any thoughts about the combat, or you want to share what you think could have made it better, I encourage you to leave a comment with your thoughts, or a comment on other people's thoughts. I want to create a space for an objective discussion on what could have been improved on with the combat of this game. And as far as that goes, when I'm with my friends, I make it pretty obnoxiously clear that I think the GBA combat is superior, but that is a subjective opinion. Okay, I think that's all I have for today. Still got lots of stuff in the queue, and I'm getting closer to reaching a state where I can talk about them fully. And I have a few other projects that I'm working on besides this Spyro project. So all that being said, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have an awesome day. Bye-bye.